Voilà, donc j'ai le plaisir d'accueillir Peter Geimer, qui est historien de l'art, qui est professeur à la Freie Universität de Berlin et directeur du Centre allemand d'histoire de l'art. Merci beaucoup d'être avec nous ce matin.
Voilà, un grand merci pour cette invitation. Je me réjouis énormément d'être ici. Excusez-moi que je n'étais pas ici hier parce que je devais enseigner à Berlin, mais maintenant je suis là et on commence. La section s'appelle Collaborating with the Machine, collaborer avec la machine. Donc c'est un titre très intéressant qui dit déjà que la machine apparemment a une vie propre, mais on peut collaborer avec elle. Et je crois que les trois interventions vont traiter de ce tension entre hommes, artistes féminines et machines. Nous avons trois interventions. Chaque intervention va traiter d'une seule artiste. Et maintenant, on continue en anglais parce qu'on a deux conférences en anglais, une conférence en français. Donc, we switch to English now. And I have the pleasure to present our first speaker, Richard Torchia from Arcadia University, Pennsylvania. He is director of the Arcadia exhibitions. So he works as a curator at his university and teaches courses in curatorial practice. He has organized a huge number of exhibitions with artists like Ai Weiwei, Tacita Dean, Olafur Eliasson, Keith Haring, Candida Höfer, and many, many others. And among them, Pati Hill, the artist he will focus on today. He also did a number of thematic exhibitions, and there's one that I found specifically fascinating, namely about childhood drawings of contemporary artists. So that's a very interesting topic, I think. And already in 1983, sorry, he curated an exhibition about the use of the photocopy machine in art. So he was really at the beginning of the topic that is interesting for us today. He did this exhibition at Princeton Art Museum. He published lots of catalog essays about the artists I mentioned already. He edited the first monograph of two Philadelphia-based artists, Tristan Lowe and Bill Watson. And last but not least, he's also an artist. So he works with the Camera Oscura and he makes specific installation with the Camera Oscura, and you can see them, these installations, in the permanent exhibitions of the Philadelphia Museum of Modern Art and the library of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And now it's up to you, Richard Torchia. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be here and in the presence of an audience that maybe for the first time talking about Pati Hill, I don't have to make a case for her work, but I can indulge in other aspects of her life and her practice. And for this talk, I think I coined a word. I'm not sure that that word, which I'm going to try to say right now, xérographilie, ever existed before, but it does seem to describe one way of conveying Pati Hill's relationship to the machine. There was certainly a kind of affection, but also I need to say right away an ambivalence about her relationship with the copier, and I'll get into that shortly. There's certainly an evolution. She lived a long life. She was born in 1921 and initially entered the public sphere as a model, although she always wanted to be a writer. And this is just a random selection of a book. There's many, many books. We'll get into that later. She kept her copies and found it difficult to throw them away. Her archive is full of pieces of paper, pages like this that she bound. And this is just, again, a random selection. You can see it's a photocopy, I think not on the IBM, which she came to use and prefer, but this is an image, a photograph of her as a model bound into a book. On the left, you can sort of see it's a through the page, like that beautiful postcard picture we saw last night of the Man Ray, an image of Patti coming through the paper, a photograph that was used on the back of one of her novels. I wanted to show just a photograph of these 5 books that she wrote between the years 1955 and 62. She was very prolific during that period of her life. She actually went to live in a cabin in the French countryside where she cut her hair famously and wrote her first 2 books. The Pit and the Century Plant is a memoir. The 9 Mile Circle is a novel, sort of in the style of Faulkner. And the last book on the right is called The Snow Rabbit. It was a collaboration with Galway Cannell, a poet. And I want to mention that because collaboration is a huge aspect of Patti's practice. And very interesting for her to, as a writer, her first book of poems, to collaborate with a poet who is providing the illustrations. So that right away you sort of see a kind of innovation in terms of this conversation about interacting with another, the need for a collaborator. And these are a selection of books that were published beginning in 1974, a book called Slave Days. And these 5 publications just came out from 1974, or sorry, I should say 75 to 79. And the book on the far right is called Letters to Jill, which is a kind of catalog and some notes on copying. It is just the beginning of many, many comments that she made about the copier. In 1979, after working with it for 5 years, she continued to contribute and sort of compile a file of comments about her practice, which we're still discovering in the archive. And so it's fascinating to actually have access to so much material that is still waiting to be discovered. So it feels like we're still in conversation with Patti. She died in, I should say, in 2014 at the age of 93. And she is known maybe for being one of the most prolific artists to work with the copier. She started in 1974 and basically never finished. She actually said that even though she might lose her taste for the look of copier work, she could never work without the machine. So in a way, the machine became a kind of partner in all kinds of work that she continued to do, whether it was visual or written. In 1962, after she published her 3rd novel called One Thing I Know, she had a child, her only daughter, Paula, but at the same time quit writing to take up housekeeping, as she said, and began collecting what she called informational art. This is one example of many, many in the archive in her collection. She photocopied them later, but this is one example of an offset. And it's fascinating to think about why. She loved the way in which image and text were brought together in a decisive way very quickly to sort of convey information in a decisive and effective way. But after 13 years of basically not doing any publishing, though she had residencies and continued to work privately, the struggle to sort of find the time to raise a child and manage a house, I think prevented her from actively releasing any of her work. And then in 1974, she started to, the way she describes 2 different ways in which she began to work with the machine. She was copying some of her manuscripts and noticed that the edge, a copy of the tip of her thumb on the side of one of the pages. And then she decided that there were household items that she wanted to throw away and to remember them before she discarded them. She brought them to the machine, not even using the copier herself. She claimed that she brought the objects to a local copy shop and had the attendant make the photocopies. And by luck, the machine that happened to be in this copy shop near Stonington, Connecticut, where she was living at the time, happened to be an IBM machine, which was made for the business industry. It was very different from the Xerox machine. It was not even released until 1970. The Xerox's 914 was basically introduced to the public in 1960. But she very quickly fell in love with the blacks that it was able to produce, and the shallow depth of field. And what I find really interesting here is that initially she was copying things, bringing them to the platen of the machine, and there's almost a sense of preciousness here. There's a copy of a paperclip, a button, an eraser, and a hair curler here. And this is something else that we found in the archive, a kind of way to preserve and store and maybe reference these things for further use and possible publication. And I want to point out the way she's writing: actual size, actual intensity, the one-to-one ratio of the machine. The IBM did not enlarge or reduce even in 1970. So she found a way of, instead of finding that a limitation, was finding it a kind of an advantage for the sort of way in which these images function like objects in and of themselves. And the choices of the things that she brought to the machine are compelling to think about. She talked about how her initial work was about, mostly about what she would bring to the machine and not so much about printing, which she got very interested in later. So here's the IBM Copier 2. It was only on the market for a short time, again, used by mostly by businesses. It wasn't until 1974 or 5 that they figured out how to add a coin operating device to it so it could be placed in laundromats in public places. This is actually the machine that she used later in Paris and when she relocated to France in the early 80s. But it's a recent photograph taken in the archive at Arcadia. So you get a sense of the object itself. And famously, she provided this definition of it. And this is why we called the exhibition we did in 2016 Photocopier, which is also a way to refer to Pati herself, the way typewriter would be the name of a person who worked with a typewriter. So the word photocopier can actually refer to a person as well. And I want to read this because the writing is so telling of her sensibility and her use of language. This stocky, unrevealing box stands 3 feet high without stockings or feet and lights up like a Christmas tree no matter what I show it. It repeats my words perfectly as many times as I ask it to, but when I show it a hair curler, it hands me back a spaceship, and when I show it the inside of a straw hat, it describes the eerie joys of a descent into a volcano. This writing to me is just so affecting. She very quickly, she doesn't miss a trick. I mean, she anthropomorphizes the machine. It's standing without stockings or feet. It lights up. She spells Christmas tree with an X, I think, consciously to reference xerography. And it hands her back the print. She tended to believe that the prints were finished when they came out of the machine. Unlike other artists using the machine, she never manipulated it initially. She'd never used collage. It was like her job was to select what to copy, to bring it to the machine, and then have these pages that she initially cut up and eventually started to work with. It's important, I think, to look at some of these early, they're very small works. I mean, this is a life-size image of a tiny doll. It's maybe an inch high. But these little white spots that you see, she called stars, and they're actually places on the print where the toner doesn't adhere. And she loved these accidents and flaws, and actually tried to cultivate them. She figured out ways to eventually add toner, which she knew would create more stars, which suddenly gives you this feeling that this tiny little plastic doll is an astronaut. And the shallow depth of field that quickly but sort of imperceptibly goes from this tactile contact with the glass, which we can't see, of course, to this idea of space is what really impelled her. And she started, I think, to think of the world as things that could be copied. She actually called them copyables, and things that couldn't. And then there were things in between, like this light bulb, which is sort of like, you can sort of see the corona of the top edge there, and the hardware down beneath is very visibly captured. And what I enjoy about this print is the way that those little bars of light are actually a record of the scanning bar going across the reflective surface. And then something like this was a classic copyable in the sense that it's a two-dimensional, three-dimensional object that's just in a way asking to be scanned, if we can use that word. It's a piece of trash, really, but somehow it becomes something else when it's copied. And this is this kind of transformation she enjoyed. It's so generative in the sense that if we can identify that as a bunch of matches she might have picked up off the pavement, that is one way to respond to this print, but suddenly it's so many other things. And the copier's ability to see and transform and to sort of reintroduce these simple things as if they were being seen for the first time by another physiognomy in a way. And she referred often to the rectangular eye of the copier. This is a page from slave days. So this is a photocopy that's been offset printed. But I wanted to show it, of course, because here we are in Paris. But when I saw, we have the original object, which is sort of a pathetic and very sad-looking broken toy made out of yellow plastic. And there's something almost grand and architectural. You can sort of feel the city light bouncing off this abject object in a way. It's so more dignified than the original, and that sort of generate production of value out of nothing is sort of what I think compelled her. And I'm going to quickly go through this list. In this book, Letters to Jill, she offered a definition of the copier. She wrote it for her dealer, who gave her 5 shows, and that's based between 1975 and 79. And her dealer herself, Jill Cornbly, didn't really understand what Patti was doing, and Patti felt it was great that actually these letters exist, because it gave her a chance to write about what she was doing, which she did so beautifully. Maybe I won't read all of them, but I mean, the number 2, Patti was not so good with numbers. I mean, 8 by 11 is wrong. It's 8.5 by 11. But the image is life size. The important fact about the copier being relatively expensive to rent, but inexpensive to use when at a copy shop. Unmessily instantaneous. The instantaneity of the machine was definitely something that was important to her as somebody who valued every second. Her reading her journals, you get a sense of the constant battle to save time. The copier reproduces line details with a greater accuracy than a camera or the human hand, though painting sometimes gives the illusion of this kind of clarity. So she in many ways, thought she had come across this way of using the machine on her own. It's hard to believe. And she's constantly needing to compare what the medium of xerography with other disciplines. And that is a sort of motivating factor in her work. And we yesterday heard several references to the copier as a camera, which is something that I think she would argue about. The depth perception of the copier is shallow. Your object is your negative. That to me is kind of mind-blowing in the sense that it suggests that the world is already a thing that's waiting to be printed. It's like a sort of, mind-blowing reinvention of how to think about reality to some extent. I may be exaggerating, but The idea that she's using that metaphor of photography to sort of rethink what it means to bring things to the copier. And of course, it's the blindness of the activity, the side of the subject that you do not see is what's reproduced. So there's this constant surprise that comes out of the machine. The yes-no principle, the sort of binary that's there, the incipient idea of the digital is waiting to some extent. I would say that she refers to the evolution of the copier. She knows that the computer is basically going to sort of overtake this thing that she's just fell in love with. And there's almost a sadness despite the sort of optimism and the promise of this medium she's talking about. And then the fact that she decides what is up or down, and it's amazing the number of times she rethought what was the proper orientation of anything that she copied. And then, of course, the obvious that you're using the machine to make art that was designed for a very limited set of functions that, as we know from yesterday, that I don't think the manufacturers or the designers of the machine realized what a gift they gave to artists. And I want to dwell a little bit more on, this is, for example, I think a reference to her modeling work, but for me, when I think of this compact, it, to me, is an image of a copier as much as anything else. There's a mirror, there's this sort of lid that that the fact that she copied so many of the things that she imaged with the lid up actually stripped the machines of its toner, and eventually she was told that she could not use the machines she was using at the local shop to copy objects because the toner was being used up too quickly. She could only copy manuscripts. And that drove her to sort of find another way to make her work. This, I think, is important because she obviously knew about Roy Lichtenstein and pop art, and it was great that pop art came up yesterday. It looks a little bit like the informational art that red print of the Lamb chart, but the fact that she chose to crumple up this little, it's a, maybe you remember these comics that would come in bubblegum, and she sort of, in a way, interferes with our ability to read the comic, but also asserts that it's a piece of paper. This is a work that, so a lot of these small little prints she eventually published in her second book of poetry. I particularly love this image of the hairpins. I'll read the text. It's an untitled work, but the text is, "Heaven's door is open to us like a big vacuum cleaner. Oh, help. Oh, clouds of dust, oh, choirs of hairpins." And so that this image on the left illustrates the text a little bit more than some of the other examples in the book. She was very interested in this relationship between image and text. She wanted to fuse them together in ways that the copier seemed built for. But she also, in her practice, developed a symbol language. Her daughter was raised bilingual. She herself learned to speak French thanks to her modeling career. She eventually settled in Paris and Sens eventually. But this is one of many of about 45 pages we have of a language she invented, inspired by her daughter's hieroglyphics. And at the time, she, again, going back to the symbol language, the informational art, finding a way to communicate very quickly and decisively. And so the connection between the hairpins and the symbols there are, I think, fundamental to how she thought of her images as symbols. This is a postcard she published. Her first show with Jill Cornbly was called Photocopied Objects. This is a pocket mirror, but you wouldn't know that unless I told you. This is the back of the card, which is telling. I'm interested in the fact that she chose to refer, this is like the first time or the second time she had to find a name for what she was doing, and she chose the word xerograph, which means something written dryly, or an example of dry writing, like a photograph. And she insists that the fact that she's got a 1-to-1 ratio there, talking about actual size, again, sort of celebrating the fact that this limitation of the machine. So she had been working on a novel called An Angry French Housewife years before her encounter with the copier, and actually published half of it without any images in 1974. And this is just to sort of assert that she was not only interested in what the machine did with objects, but how it transformed photographs. And at a certain point, this is one example. This is a photograph on the left. The original is by, I'll get her name here, Eva Rubinstein. And on the right is the photocopy, what the IBM machine had done to it. The halos around the palm leaves sort of suggest solarization that we know from Man Ray, but it's actually a sort of function of the toner and the way the machine actually responds to the intense contrasts of subjects like that. So this book was published in 1976 with help from money from the NEA. She was, by that time, had figured out how to write a grant successfully. But the publisher, Alice James, was very unhappy with the idea of adding these photographs, which she had to pay for herself. And in the end, the book was published with 45 different photographs that are all sort of harmonized, but the 45 different photos from maybe about 30 or so different sources. She requested permission from each of the photographers, but the copier sort of harmonizes and makes them look more similar. It sort of gives, it basically gives, they're not really illustrations. Again, they sort of work sometimes against the text and sort of create this sort of thing that together adds to creates an atmosphere and another sort of dimension to the novel. But tellingly, she says the photographs in this book have been processed to give them greater unity, but doesn't refer to the copier at all. I think if she tried to acquire these images from the photographers, if she had told them that they were going to be just photocopied, they would have not given permission. And then this is to show that she was also a kind of self-taught graphic designer. This is a sort of headache to consider, but this is a mock-up of the book, and to show that she actually was actively involved in the placement of the images and the text on the page. I'm trying to go faster here. This is a map that she drew, that was, I think, drawn for her. Forgive the picture, it's actually taken on a screen. I've never seen the original, but her friend, Sibby Lynch, in Stonington, provided this for us. She made a lot of work when she was no longer allowed to photocopy objects at the local copier shop. She got a friend of hers worked at IBM headquarters in New York, and she spent several weekends photocopying clothes in there on the IBM's own machine, sort of stealthily or surreptitiously, to make images like this. And these are dramatically different from the earlier images. They use the full page. This is an image made on colored paper. And this is a pair of riding pants that the original is on pink paper, on legal size paper. Notice the flaws at the bottom, which she loved. And then eventually it was published in a magazine called New Writing, I think. Let me get this right. But I want to read this text because it basically shows that she's starting to talk to her photocopies as if they were not only the objects they depict, but the copy itself. She writes, riding pants circa 1940 or 50. I found them in a local thrift shop and have hung them on the wall like a landscape full of highways and byways of tiny stitches, irregular suede and cotton fields, ravines, plowings, etc. On second thought, maybe they're more like an airplane, so beautifully tacked together with flaps for folding up or down and stress points reinforced. I don't know why the vision of a straitjacket has come into my head. I saw one once, but it was a sleazy thing. I'll stop there. But so she's starting to write about the images as not as the subjects, but actually as photocopied. This is another example of a series called Dreams, Objects, Moments, where she's describing objects that are trapped in asphalt. So again, and how difficult it is to pry them out from the asphalt. So it's again, this is a work that she made when she had no longer couldn't get access to the machine. So she's starting to literally write about the copier and sort of in a lament, but also a celebration of the machine. And she eventually did an entire show of 100 of these sheets of paper, printed on blue, pink, and yellow paper. In 1976, again, it's basically a conceptual installation that she knew people didn't enjoy. That she said people didn't like reading standing up. She was very aware of that. Here's an image. Eventually, she did receive a copier on loan from IBM for about 6 months initially, and she stretched the loan out to a period of 30 months. And again, there was lots of debate about when this copier would return to IBM, but finally she had access to her own machine. Here she is putting extra toner in the till and being here's an image of a telephone. And just by this time she had the machine at home and she could just use as much toner as she wanted. And I just love the way the receiver and the earpiece and the mouthpiece are sort of separated by this ink sea of black toner and stars. She, broke an egg on the machine at home. She could do that because it was hers in a way. And here's just to make a point about the fact that we're always looking from underneath a glass ceiling, as it were, at objects that are sort of resting on the top of this table, as if we were inside looking up. And this is we don't know if it's a male or a female shoe, but it makes me think of her attempt to copy Versailles that I need to mention here. Her plan eventually was to, instead of copying things that could be easily copied, to copy something that could never be copied. And it started as a joke almost, but it became a project that consumed the next 25 years of her life. And maybe I'll stop there. I could go on. I hope I've given you some sense of her complicated relationship to the machine, but also to this idea of dry writing and her, the way in which it basically becomes something she couldn't work without. Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Richard, for this very fascinating talk and insight into Pati Hill's work. And now we continue in French, because the next talk will be given in French. Et j'ai le plaisir de vous présenter Taous Dahmani, historienne d'art. Elle est située à Paris et à Londres. Elle enseigne l'histoire de la photographie ici à Paris, à l'université Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne, surtout l'histoire de la photographie du XXe siècle. Elle est en train de terminer une thèse de doctorat intitulée, je crois en anglais, n'est-ce pas? Vous écrit la thèse,
non,
le titre. De toute façon, je le titre en anglais, excusez-moi. Direct Action Photography, a Typography of the Photographic Representation of Struggle and the Struggle for Photographic Representations, London, 1958 to 1980. Elle a reçu le prix de la chancellerie, le prix qui a donné la possibilité d'aller à Oxford, à la maison française à Oxford, et dans ce cadre, elle a organisé un colloque sous le titre « Let us now praise famous women, women's labor to uncover the works of female photographers ». Elle a publié un grand nombre d'articles et elle s'intéresse surtout à la question comment la photographie est liée à des questions politiques, des questions de pouvoir. Et voilà. Et maintenant, elle va présenter une intervention, l'art de l'immédiateté de Rita Keegan.
Merci beaucoup pour cette introduction. I'm so sorry. I'm going to say thank you in English and then I'm going to switch back to French. Thank you, morning, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you Zana Gilbert and Judith for inviting me to help you to give a paper today, but also to be able to work with you this past few weeks and months. Actually, it's been amazing. So I'll switch back to French, and hopefully you have my paper in English for those of you that don't speak French. And I'll start with my introduction. Au printemps 2019, après quelques échanges via Facebook, le seul moyen que j'avais alors trouvé pour entrer en contact avec elle, Rita Keegan m'a invité chez elle à Vauxhall, dans le sud de Londres, pour parler de son parcours et de ses multiples pratiques artistiques. Lorsque le moment est venu pour elle de me montrer ses montages à la photocopie, la raison pour laquelle je l'avais contactée en premier lieu, elle a entrepris de récupérer des dossiers derrière le canapé où nous étions assises. En effet, pendant des décennies, son salon a été l'espace informel de ses archives personnelles. C'est dans ce contexte peu orthodoxe que j'ai vu, manipuler et photographier pour la première fois le travail xérographique de Rita Keegan. Alors qu'elle était assise dans le coin de son canapé en velours, près de la baie vitrée, et qu'elle me racontait ses souvenirs entre New York et San Francisco dans les années 60 et 70, puis son déménagement en Angleterre en 1980. Alors que je partage avec vous mes premiers souvenirs de ma rencontre avec Rita Keegan, la South London Gallery, l'une des principales institutions londoniennes d'art contemporain, va bientôt fermer les portes de la première rétrospective de Keegan. Plus de 40 ans après son installation à Londres, à l'âge de 72 ans, l'artiste féministe britannique d'origine américaine, Rita Keegan, obtient enfin une reconnaissance des institutions artistiques. Le constat d'une évolution indéniable entre ma première découverte du nom de Keegan, alors mentionné dans une brochure des années 1980, dès 2015, puis ma rencontre avec elle en 2019, et enfin l'ouverture de l'ouverture de l'exposition en 2021, m'a donné envie de structurer cette communication selon deux axes principaux. D'abord, un retour sur sa vie et sa pratique, puisque les faits relatifs à sa biographie et à sa démarche artistique restent encore peu étudiés et peu connus, en se concentrant bien évidemment sur son travail xérographique au milieu des années 80, et enfin peut-être ouvrir la conversation sur la reconnaissance tardive à travers l'analyse d'un faisceau d'indices qui pourrait expliquer cette reconnaissance tardive, et en ouvrant sur des questions de genre et de race, et une réflexion sur les considérations traditionnelles de l'art de la copie comme une pratique mineure ou un low art. Ces deux axes finalement sont entremêlés, comme vous le verrez, parce que la vie et l'art de Keegan sont profondément liés. Ma première partie, donc, le voyage transatlantique d'une artiste féministe. Née dans le Bronx en 1949 d'une mère dominicaine et d'un père africain-canadien, Rita Keegan a fréquenté la High School of Art and Design à Manhattan. Si la majeure partie de sa jeunesse s'est déroulée sur la côte Est, Keegan part sur la côte Ouest pour suivre sa formation universitaire. En 1969, elle entre au San Francisco Art Institute, d'où elle sort diplômée en 1972. Après avoir suivi les enseignements de la photographe américaine Imogen Cunningham, la peintre africaine-américaine Mary Lovelace O'Neill et l'artiste d'assemblage africaine-américaine Betty Saar. Si ces figures de l'art nord-américain du XXe siècle sont impressionnantes en soi, elles sont encore plus importantes pour la jeune Rita Keegan, qui voit, surtout en O'Neill et Saar, de réels modèles. Elles offrent la liberté à la jeune artiste de s'imaginer de devenir un jour professionnelle et la possibilité de le faire en expérimentant une multitude de médiums. En effet, à l'Institut d'art de San Francisco, Keegan peint, dessine et confectionne des vêtements. Très tôt, du fait de son éducation, Keegan ne conçoit pas de hiérarchie entre sa pratique de peinture et ses activités liées à la mode. Ce qui nous donne une première indication, ou des premières indications, sur son manque d'intérêt pour les distinctions traditionnelles entre les arts visuels et l'artisanat, ou pour toutes sortes de pyramides de valeurs artistiques. Deux autres éléments persuadent Rita Keegan, dès son enfance, de la possibilité de devenir artiste, même en grandissant dans les États-Unis de la ségrégation. D'abord, sa connaissance des artistes de la Harlem Renaissance, qui date de 1918 à 1930, mais aussi sa relation avec son oncle, Keith Simon, né en 22 et décédé en 2013, un peintre caribéen formé à l'université de Howard, membre de le Caribbean Arts Movement et qui a notamment une exposition au Commonwealth Institute à Londres en 71. Cependant, malgré ses débuts plutôt positifs en tant que jeune artiste, compte tenu du contexte sociopolitique des États-Unis, Rita Keegan a du mal à trouver sa place dans les scènes artistiques new-yorkaises et californiennes et par conséquent décide de s'installer à Londres en 1980. Citoyenne de seconde zone dans son pays d'origine, elle découvre son américanéité dans l'Angleterre de Margaret Thatcher et se lie rapidement d'amitié avec les artistes de la scène émergente noire britannique. Au cours de notre conversation, Rita Keegan me décrit son arrivée en Angleterre comme suit, je cite et je traduis, « Être ici, c'est-à-dire être à Londres, signifiait que j'ai eu l'opportunité d'être américaine pour la première fois. Être américaine pour la première fois était fascinant, parce que la culture l'emporte sur la race. Lorsqu'elle faisait l'expérience d'un autre type de relation raciale à Londres, à un moment où les citoyens britanniques noirs luttaient pour leurs droits et leurs libertés dans le sillage des manifestations anti-apartheid, Keegan s'est également heurtée aux règles et considérations de l'establishment artistique britannique. Elle m'explique, je cite et je traduis une nouvelle fois, « Aux États-Unis, si vous pouvez le mettre sur un mur ou sur un socle, c'est de l'art. Ils peuvent le vendre. Je n'ai pas grandi sur le plan artistique dans un monde qui avait des hiérarchies de fabrication, alors que l'Europe est très ancrée dans une définition précise de ce qu'est l'art. Malgré les contraintes normatives et conservatrices européennes, sa vie à Londres, au début des années 80, est à la fois alternative et radicale. Elle participe à des groupes d'éveil des consciences, CR Groups, enseigne aux féministes blanches l'intersection des luttes, fait la fête à Soho, où un mixologue nomme même un cocktail après elle. En 1981, elle participe à la création de la Brixton Art Gallery où elle organise l'exposition Mirror Reflecting Darkly, qui présentait les œuvres de femmes artistes britanniques noires. Et c'est notre entrée dans la question de la copie. Organisatrice d'événements, donc divers, allant de fêtes à des expositions, Keegan a d'abord utilisé la copie pour produire de modestes catalogues d'expositions, des brochures ou des affiches pour la Brixton Art Gallery. C'est ainsi en 83 qu'elle découvre le Community Copy Art, qui est alors encore une organisation itinérante, proposant des ateliers mobiles avec une seule photocopieuse dans une camionnette. Puis, en 1984, Keegan aide Copy Art à s'installer dans un bâtiment à King Cross avec le soutien financier du Camden Council et du Greater London Arts. Copy Art est équipé d'un certain nombre de photocopieurs et au fil des années, des technologies dites émergentes telles que les premières versions des scanners ou encore les premiers ordinateurs. Copy Art fonctionne comme une coopérative avec 7 salariés à temps partiel, dont un poste occupé par Rita Keegan. Le projet fonctionne comme une coopérative, donc avec des réunions hebdomadaires où tous les membres dirigent des projets et décident de sa direction collectivement. Considéré par ses fondateurs comme une structure de résistance, et je les cite là, Copy Art est pour eux un moyen de construire un espace public d'opposition. L'espace offre la possibilité de faire des photocopies à prix raisonnable, tant pour les associations que pour les organisations militantes ou que pour les jeunes artistes explorant les possibilités de la copie. Alan D'Souza va utiliser Copy Art, Jamie Reed et bien sûr Ellen Chadwick, qui sont tous donc passés par Copy Art. L'espace est décrit par le photographe, écrivain, professeur et artiste multimédia nord-américain d'origine kenyane Alan D'Souza comme, je cite et je traduis, un collectif d'artistes socialistes, anarchistes, mais pas communistes. Aussi, à partir du milieu des années 80, Copy Art dispose de salles dédiées aux expositions et collabore avec d'autres collectifs accueillant des événements tels que le Festival du Plagiat ou l'exposition A Family Album. Did I put the slide? Yes. A Family Album, an exhibition by Brixton Black women artists qui s'est tenue en 91 et qui présente entre autres le travail de Keegan. Pour les jeunes créatifs, la différence cruciale entre Copy Art et les autres ateliers de reprographie est la liberté de manipuler les machines eux-mêmes et d'avoir accès à une grande variété de matériaux. Comme le dit Keegan, je cite et je traduis, si vous avez accès à la copie, vous allez faire des choses avec. En 1984, Keegan commence une longue période de travail avec un photocopieur Canon NP de 2010, avec 6 teneurs d'encre bleue, rouge, verte, brune et noire. L'accès gratuit à une photocopieuse couleur lui offre la possibilité d'explorer l'art du montage. Armé de Tipex, d'un bâton de cold prit et d'un cutter ex-acto. Les montages de Keegan sont composés et construits avec l'expertise et la délicatesse de celle qu'elle a acquise grâce à la couture. Abordable et transportable, l'art xérographique ne nécessite pas de studio ou de lieu de vie permanent, situation idéale pour la jeune bohème. Cette attitude de bricolage inhérente à l'art xérographique ne doit pas seulement être considérée comme un choix esthétique, mais comme une véritable éthique. Ainsi, l'art xérographique de Keegan est une célébration des productions pauvres, pour citer Ito Starrell. Keegan me confie, je cite et je traduis, « Je n'ai aucun problème avec les médias populaires, car le peuple a besoin d'une voix ». Même si elle est limitée au format A4 et A3, Keegan produit de multiples collages, expérimentant avec les superpositions, la composition et la couleur. Cependant, la pratique du Xerox de Keegan se concentre principalement sur la représentation du soi. Son art de l'immédiateté, comme elle le nomme, peut être compris comme une recherche de l'individualité au sein des multiplicités haptiques et émotionnelles. Son travail sur les photocopies est une façon de rechercher l'unicité dans les répliques. Si dans quelques collages, Keegan utilise les images trouvées, rapidement elle se sent mal à l'aise avec ce processus d'appropriation et décide de se représenter elle-même et par extension sa famille. En effet, dans les valises qu'elle ramène des États-Unis, en plus de ces tenues flamboyantes que vous avez peut-être remarquées dans les précédentes photographies que je vous ai montrées, elle rapporte des photos de sa famille noire, issue de la classe moyenne, datant du début des années 1900. Et là, vous avez une photo que j'ai prise dans son appartement, un portrait d'elle petite. Keegan explique que, je cite et je traduis, « Les photographies faisaient partie du tissu de mon enfance ». Les montages de Keegan sont aussi une façon d'explorer ses racines paternelles qui remontent de l'époque de l'Underground Railroad, utilisée par les esclaves pour s'échapper vers le Canada, récit qu'elle associe aussi à ses racines caribéennes du côté de sa mère. Comme l'explique l'écrivain et curatrice Naomi Pierce, je cite et je traduis, Rita utilise la photocopieuse comme un dispositif de voyage dans le temps pour rassembler ce qui avait été séparé. Fin de citation. Elle utilise et réutilise d'innombrables fois les mêmes photos tirées de ses albums de famille. Là où il y a répétition, il y a donc insistance, ce qui rend les portraits de Keegan fondamentalement politiques en tant qu'affirmation d'elle-même et en tant qu'artiste femme noire. Le travail de Keegan autour des albums de famille doit également être considéré dans le cadre d'une discussion plus large sur la relation entre la famille et la photographie dans les communautés africaines-américaines, comme le montrent les écrits de Tina M. Camp ou Christine Sharp. Dans ce contexte, la photographie devient alors centrale. Comme l'affirme Bell Hooks dans son essai In Our Glory, les appareils, je cite et je traduis, les appareils photos ont donné aux Noirs, quelle que soit leur classe sociale, un moyen de participer pleinement à la production des images. Fin de citation. Jouant avec les notions de temps et d'espace, l'œuvre xérographique de Keegan, qui incorpore les photographies de famille, interpelle le spectateur par sa présentation des archives familiales diasporiques comme une confirmation d'existence et d'endurance, un refus d'être effacé, situant sa famille dans les récits de la modernité. Et là, je cite Janice Shedid. Les montages de Keegan livrent également des références visuelles. Son art xérographique n'est pas seulement un art de la copie, mais un art de la répétition et des variations. Au-delà du travail des photos de famille, Keegan utilise une iconographie réduite avec la récurrence de deux motifs principaux, les fleurs et les coquillages. Les fleurs comme motif ont été de toute évidence inspirées par les autoportraits de Frida Kahlo, qu'elle admire énormément, comme en témoigne son tableau de 88 intitulé « Hommage à Frida Kahlo ». Si la peintre mexicaine, connue pour ses nombreux autoportraits, est une référence évidente pour Keegan, l'iconographie de Kahlo, inspirée par la nature et la flore sud-américaine, influence aussi les montages de Keegan. De plus, l'intérêt de Kahlo pour la représentation de sa propre famille et de ses racines a dû avoir un impact important sur la réflexion de Keegan et de son travail sur les racines. Elle me confie, je cite et je traduis, « En tant que femme de couleur, j'ai besoin d'une multiplicité de voix et donc une multiplicité de références. » On peut citer les photographies de fleurs des années 1920 de son professeur Imogen Cunningham, mais j'aimerais aussi établir d'autres parallèles comme l'art Xerox de Joan Lyons et ses motifs organiques similaires que vous voyez ici, ou le portrait Three Women de Sylvia Slay, travaillant autour de l'idée de l'âge, de la race et du genre. Son autre motif de prédilection, les coquillages, est souvent considéré au sein de la communauté noire comme un symbole d'immortalité et un moyen de guider les défunts vers l'au-delà, surtout dans le contexte de l'esclavage. Nommés les merveilles de la mer par le poète français Paul Valéry, ils sont également un motif récurrent dans les peintures de Georgia O'Keeffe. Comme le décrit le philosophe français Gaston Bachelard, ces formes sont je cite, ces formes sont si nombreuses, souvent si originales, qu'après un examen positif du monde des coquillages, l'imagination est vaincue par la réalité. En effet, les coquillages font entrer la lecture des montages de Keegan dans la sphère du symbolique. En utilisant une technologie de bureau banale, en la transformant en une machine créative, j'aimerais proposer de comprendre les montages de Xerox de Keegan en me servant de l'image du phénix. Alors que les couleurs sont brûlées par la photocopieuse, elles renaissent merveilleusement pour livrer leur capacité esthétique et politique. Je passe à ma dernière partie de l'oubli à la reconnaissance. Dans un article intitulé Copy Machines and Doubts and Scenes, Kate Ashons, spécialiste des études sur les médias, affirme, et je cite et je traduis, « Les photocopieuses ont facilité la migration de la scène. Les photocopieuses ont historiquement offert un moyen de faire connaître les scènes à la fois dans et au-delà de leur point d'origine géographique. » Et ajoute, « La xérographie contournait la censure imposée par les promoteurs, les conservateurs et les éditeurs. » Si l'article se concentre spécifiquement sur la scène Xerox de New York dans les années 70, certaines des conclusions générales peuvent sembler hâtives si nous considérons ces affirmations au-delà du cas des artistes masculins nord-américains blancs. Si l'idée de diffusion semble intrinsèquement liée à la vie des copies, le médium ne semble pas contourner les préjugés traditionnels de genre et de race, comme notre étude de cas sur la réception de Keegan peut l'attester. De même que pour d'autres artistes britanniques noirs dont les productions remontent dans les années 80, principalement à Londres, mais ça ce serait un autre sujet. Comme je l'ai précédemment mentionné, Rita Keegan a eu du mal à trouver sa place dans les scènes artistiques new-yorkaises et californiennes des années 70, celles justement décrites par Ashon, et a donc décidé de s'installer à Londres en 80. Depuis, elle a été nommée la marraine de l'art noir par l'artiste Black British Keith Piper. Pourtant, Rita Keegan a été exclue des récits officiels des historiens de l'art, mais aussi des récits alternatifs des artistes noirs britanniques. Comme Ego Awaye Sowinski le dit, c'est celle qui a dirigé le projet d'archives de Rita Keegan, l'affirme, Keegan a fait preuve de persévérance, de ténacité, de résilience et a continué à réaliser ses œuvres, même si elles ont été rarement montrées, les a néanmoins montrées régulièrement dans des lieux alternatifs et surtout archive tout. En effet, en 81, au moment de sa sortie, Keegan découvre l'ouvrage All Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology de Parker et Pollock. Cela lui confirme la nécessité d'archiver sa propre pratique en prévision d'un avenir meilleur. Archiver son travail afin de pouvoir un jour construire un héritage était pour Keegan une façon de combattre le racisme de l'establishment de l'art britannique et le sexisme de la scène artistique noire britannique. En revenant sur son parcours, Rita Keegan, et vous avez la quote sur le PowerPoint, me confirme la nécessité de la ténacité et peut-être aussi de l'espoir. Je cite et je traduis. C'est de la chance, c'est de la ténacité. Je n'avais pas de femme ou de mari pour me soutenir. C'est difficile. Je dirai jamais aux gens de ne pas le faire, mais je les laisserai jamais sous-estimer la difficulté de survivre en tant que praticien. Voilà l'essentiel. Si vous faites cela, vous devez vous attendre à ne pas posséder votre propre maison, mais ce n'est pas terminé. On parle en 2019 quand elle me dit ça, et en 2021, elle avait sa rétrospective, donc ce n'était pas terminé pour elle. Critique du sexisme structurel dans le domaine de l'histoire de l'art, All Mistresses peut aussi être utilisé aujourd'hui comme un outil de réflexion sur l'exclusion de Rita Keegan des institutions artistiques et culturelles, sur son absence des récits officiels. En 2013, dans une nouvelle préface du livre, Pollock confirme que les portes ouvertes par l'histoire de l'art féministe permettent également de penser les autres dominations. Elle écrit « En proposant le genre comme sonde », j'ai eu du mal à traduire ça, probe, j'ai dit sonde, je ne sais pas si c'est le meilleur mot. Le féminisme pourrait changer entièrement le paradigme de la pensée historique de l'art, en ouvrant l'histoire de l'art hégémonique formaliste à ses canons exclusifs et ses canons exclusifs à toutes les formes de facteurs sociaux, institutionnels et culturels qui façonnent la différence, que ce soit la classe, la race, le genre ou la sexualité, comme motif d'exclusion de l'accès à l'art et de la reconnaissance au sein du canon. Et elle ajoute artiste, femme artiste, artiste, artiste noir, artiste, artiste queer. Tous ces qualificatifs ont pour effet de marquer l'adjectif et de charger de particularités locales tout en laissant inexprimé et non marqué le terme privilégié et apparemment universel, artiste, comme espace de masculinité, de blanchité et d'hétérosexualité. Forcé à la marginalisation pour des raisons économiques, exclu des réseaux artistiques traditionnels pour des raisons de genre et de race, et ignoré par les historiens en raison d'une pratique d'un low art, Rita Keegan sort lentement de l'ombre grâce à la rétrospective de la South London Gallery. Cependant, le résultat, un tel résultat et une telle victoire doit être, à mon sens, complexifié, en particulier à la lumière d'un article de Jordana Moore-Sagis d'octobre 2021, intitulé A Call to Artists, dans lequel la rédactrice en chef de Art Journal a posé à plusieurs artistes africains-américains, aujourd'hui acclamés, la question suivante. Comment préparer et protéger les artistes noirs en particulier, qui sont appelés à corriger l'histoire de la suprématie blanche des institutions? Et j'aimerais terminer avec cette question en guise de conclusion ouverte. Merci beaucoup.
Un grand merci. Nous avons le temps de discuter cette intervention plus tard, mais maintenant on continue avec la troisième intervention. And I will switch to English again. Okay, the speaker disappeared, but I hope he will be back.
Du coup, on va enchaîner avec la troisième communication. Merci beaucoup.
Yeah, and this is
this just works with the
Jacques Jacob, excusez-moi, Lillemose University of Copenhagen. He lives in Berlin and Copenhagen. He works as a freelance curator, as a lecturer, and as a writer. In 2011, he finished his PhD at the Institute of Arts and Cultural Studies at the University of Copenhagen, and I think the title already makes clear how his interest is linked to our today's topic. The title of this dissertation is Art as Informational Tool, Critical Engagements with Contemporary Software Cultures. In 2008, he has edited an anthology about media art called We Love Your Computer, an anthology on net art. His writings appear in numerous magazines, catalogs, and journals, like Le Monde Diplomatique, for example, or Fries. He also works as a curator, and he curated, for example, a show with the films of Gordon Matta Clark, but also several exhibitions in the field of media art. He organized 2 exhibitions on the artist he will talk about today, Sonia Landy Sheridan, one exhibition in Berlin and one in Copenhagen, and he is about to write a book about this artist entitled Through the Electric Doors of Perception. And now we are looking forward to his talk, Hacking Machines, Generating Images on the Artistic Practice of Sonia Landy Sheridan.
Thank you, Peter. And first of all, thanks to the organizers for putting together this important event on a topic that I think is really long overdue in terms of art historical recognition. And I think the presentations yesterday really underscored that women and scenography, or whatever we want to term it, deserves a chapter in the history and the chronicles of 20th century art and its use of modern technology. And I'm really looking forward to continuing the discussions both today and beyond. That said, this is also a very emotional occasion for me. As you all know by now, less than 3 weeks ago, Sonia Landy Sheridan, who I had been invited to talk about here, passed away in her home in New Hampshire at the age of 96. And I can honestly say that Sonia is one of the most extraordinary human beings that I've ever met. And I know she will be an everlasting inspiration for me, both professionally and as a human being. So like others before me, I'd like to dedicate this presentation to her and the absolutely amazing creative energy that she embodied. Unfortunately, with 25 minutes at my disposal, I can't even attempt to do proper justice to her extensive and multifaceted work here. That's for future books and future exhibitions to do. So instead of this grand art historical vision, allow me to take a more personal approach. I first met Sonia in November of 2012, 9 years almost to the day. At the time, I was working as the curator of the Transmediale Art Festival in Berlin. I had decided to challenge the festival's predominant focus on young contemporary artists and was researching artists from the pioneering period of media art in the 1960s and 1970s. The year before, I had defended my PhD thesis on software art at the University of Copenhagen, and on my working desk, I had a copy of the catalog from Jack Burnham's seminal exhibition entitled Software, Information Technology and Its New Meaning for Art, that ran in the fall of 1970 at the Jewish Museum in New York City. Like the exhibition itself, the catalog was a fascinating juxtaposition of presentations of emerging information technologies and artistic practices engaged with processing information, both conceptually and through the use of electronic media. On page 24 of that catalog was a photo of a young woman putting her head on the glass plate of a photocopying machine. Next to her stood an elder woman wearing glasses and a white lab coat, supervising the playful scenario with a serious focus. That woman was Sonia Landy Sheridan, and the photo documented her contribution to the software exhibition, an installation entitled Interactive Paper Systems. The setup was straightforward. Sonia had borrowed the revolutionizing state-of-the-art color-in-color photocopying machine from the Ibm Corporation, and she invited visitors to experiment creatively with the machine to make their own images free of charge. According to Sonia, almost all the visitors made the same 2 images. First, an image of whatever they had in their pockets, and a second image of their face. Unfortunately, the records of those images doesn't exist. I've been trying to hunt them down, but that would really be something to find. Anyways, I was familiar with the photo and the work for my PhD research, but I had only briefly mentioned Sonia in my thesis. Yet for some reason, when I picked up the software catalog one day in early September of 2012, I knew immediately that she was the artist I wanted to feature in the exhibition at the Transmediale. That was eventually going to be entitled Imagining with Machine Processes. I admit, I actually didn't know if Sonia was still alive, now more than 40 years after that photo was taken, and she would be 85. But within days, I was emailing and Facebooking with her daily, discussing the prospect of the exhibition, her first solo exhibition in Europe, to which she had agreed without hesitation. So she was, indeed, still very much alive. This initial communication turned out to be the beginning of a loving friendship across generations, built on a common engagement in art, technology, and the universal question of human existence. Right away, she invited me to the Facebook group that she has set up to facilitate communication with her former students at the Generative Systems art program that she ran at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago from 1970 to 1980. And just 2 months later, I was sitting in her living room as she talked for, I think, 7 hours straight, not only about the work for the exhibition, but also about her life, her childhood, her marriage, her extended global family of former colleagues and students, and also how Andy Warhol had visited the installation at the software exhibition several times, but had always been too shy to come forward and actually use the machine. Meeting Sonia and curating the exhibition at Transmediale made me realize that I had only touched the surface of her incredible rich artistic practice. So in the fall of 2013, I visited her again as part of the research for another solo exhibition with her work, this time at the House of Danish Graphic Artists in Copenhagen, a show that was entitled Visions of the Machine Environment. That exhibition in turn led to the publication of the booklet Through the Electric Doors of Perception. I have copies here that you are welcome to take afterwards. The publication was inspired by an anecdote. The title, well, the whole publication was, but the title especially was inspired by an anecdote from the illustrated book, The Electric Garden, an inner landscape book that Sonia self-published in 1974. As the anecdote goes, one night Sonia was experimenting with a kit for making Kirlian photographs, or electrophotography, that contained a transformer and an instruction for using Polaroid film to capture the aura of objects. In the dark that was needed for the kit to work, she by mistake picked up a piece of intermediate intended for use in the photocopying machine from the software exhibition. That intermediate had a mylar base and a zinc coating, as well as a magnetic registration strip. So when she unknowingly touched the electrified material, the transformer gave a loud pop and sorted out. She very quickly began to feel very strange and ill at ease, but instead of going to bed, she sat down to produce the 20 drawings that make up the book. The drawings explore the expansion of her mind and senses that the electroshock, or mild electroshock, had produced with both fascination and fear. And I'll just go through some of them, or show you some of them. Yeah, some of the early ones where you can see her body basically glowing from the electroshock. These are some of the earlier drawings she did. Then later in the book, towards the end, the fear of something being actually wrong or she is in danger becomes obvious. And it says here on the picture on the right, "I'm frightened and will not cease and desist. I'm panicked," so on and so forth. She survived, but nevertheless, a dramatic experience. Sonia herself, also in the preface to the book, linked the experience to the mescaline-induced trip. The author Aldous Huxley describes in the essay The Doors of Perception from 1954. While her experience was not psychedelic in the proper sense, it was characterized by a heightened and deepened consciousness of herself and the world around her that compares to what Huxley experienced during his trip. More specifically, it expresses an expanded perception of electronic media as a means of philosophical and poetic image making. And that leads me to the major point I want to make today. Let's take a... While the installation shot of her with the photocopying machine at the software exhibition had served as my entrance to Sonia's practice, I soon learned not to mistake her for a copy artist or photocopy artist. As she told me directly, "I will only do the show if you don't call me a copy artist. I'm a generative artist." Or as she put it in a 1983 article for Leonardo magazine, where she was also an editor at some point, "There could hardly be a more inappropriate term than copy art, as it is based, quote, on a misconception about the true nature of the tools." So to be clear, in this context, Sonia never made copies. She generated images. She never used photocopying technology or any other technology for that matter to reproduce an existing image, but to generate new images. Thousands and thousands of new images of flowers and people, often herself, as seen through the lens of her unique machine vision. Images that expanded the perception of the world through technology, or if you will, images that opened the electronic doors of perception. And of course, images of both visual beauty and conceptual wit. So while it might be obvious to connect Sonia to the copy art tradition that Warhol popularized, maybe even inspired by Sonia's installation at the subway of the exhibition, we can speculate about that, it's also a misleading connection. The copy, both as an artifact and as a concept, was of no relevance to Sonia's practice and its merging of art and technology. She was interested in the singular image and in the process of generating multiple singular images. In that context, it's interesting, or it's telling, that the filmmaker Stan Van der Beek, who Sonia collaborated with on several occasions, used to tell her, "Sonia, you are a filmmaker," which was a characterization she happily agreed to. She never made film proper, although together with Van der Beek, she did record a couple of short videos with the two of them playing around with an early image-making software, but that was not what she was referring to. Sonia was a filmmaker in a more abstract sense. The images she generated unfolded in time through processes of transformation, either within a single image or a series of images. But time had been an explicit topic of her work from an early age when she was a painter, long before she'd gotten her hands on electronic media, and it was a topic she returned to again and again in our conversations. For her, time was the most basic condition of life, a complex and fascinating dimension, and as is evident from her continuous use of the word time in her titles, she dedicated her work to exploring this invisible phenomenon, paradoxically, through images. Back in 2017, she sent me a message on Facebook saying that she had long been a huge fan of Serbian innovator Nikola Tesla, and she included the following image with a quote by him. The quote reads, "If you wish to understand the universe, think of energy, frequency, and vibration." The quote speaks to Tesla's vision of wireless transmission of electricity. In relation to Sonia, I take the quote to point to how she understood her images not as representations of objects and people, but as indexes of a transmission of energy, of the energy, frequencies, and vibrations that characterizes the process of time. Tesla's quote also points to the workings of the electric and later digital machines that Sonia worked with, and it was therefore only obvious that she wanted to explore the new possibilities for her engagement with time and temporal processes that these machines offered. However, she never used the machines, or machine systems as she referred to them, by simply following the manual. Instead, she explored the machines outside their programmed purposes, experimenting with their possibilities and limitations for generating images by interfering with them and by connecting them to other machines to make so-called hybrids. For instance, she raised the needle of the telecopier on the receiving end to create elongated images, and she used chemically treated paper intended for use in the thermofax, running it through the color and color photocopying machine. But these are just two of a seemingly endless series of machine experiments that Sonia carried out from the late 1960s and more than 50 years onwards. So in other words, Sonia was a hacker, although no one ever called her that until I did in the catalog for the Transmediale exhibition back in 2012. I think she liked it. She would refer to it several times when we talk, so that's really nice. Like Sonia, the original hackers that emerged with the computer culture of the early 1970s, they experimented with machines, some of them even homemade, for non-conforming purposes, some technologically inventive, and others socially playful. For Sonia, hacking machines was a way of appropriating the machine for artistic purposes, for generating images of aesthetic value rather than serving businesses and office purposes. The machines she hacked were produced and marketed for the new technology-driven business and office culture that had been booming since the late 1960s. But as she so intriguingly demonstrated, the machines were capable of so much more. When she did artist in residencies at both at the 3M and Xerox, the engineers who had invented the machines would often tell her that she knew more about the machines than they did. She knew them better, in fact. The same engineers would also lend her machines for the generative systems program, so she could experiment with them there and educate not only the students, but also the engineers themselves. I think that's a really fascinating part of her story. It's been wonderful to see the images also shown yesterday of what happened in generative system workshop. Such a incredible scene that you can only, I wish I was a part of. Luckily Marissa is here to tell us how it was. So, when I invited Sonia to exhibit at the Transmediale, I want to celebrate her as a pioneer of media art, but I also wanted to show that she was a contemporary artist in the sense that her body of work connects to the discussion of art and technology today. Not only does it anticipate things we know as glitch art, software art, and even net art, with its vision and ingenuity, it shows how machines can serve art making as an empowering human activity that prevents machines from taking control over human life. So to conclude, I hope this event will generate an increased interest in her practice and its art historical significance. Moreover, I hope the legacy of her practice will inspire future artists and engineers or programmers to work closely together in developing imaging machines, as Sonia called them, machines for generating images that, like the images Sonia herself generated, critically and playfully engages with the universal question of human existence in the context of an accelerated technological environment. And that's really what I'm talking about here, connecting her work to discussions of Herbert Marcuse and Marshall McLuhan in a contemporary context. And finally, to compensate for the shortcomings of this presentation, I encourage everyone to check out the incredibly online archive of Sonia's work at the website of the Daniel Langlois Foundation. It's an amazing resource for anyone who's interested in this. It features not only works, but also interviews, catalogizations of all sorts. It's really an amazing resource to continue exploring this unique work in this context. So yeah, with that I'll say thank you and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks again to all the three speakers, and now there's time for discussion. So may I ask the speakers to come in front. Okay, there's already a first question. Okay, but there is. So you can pose questions either in English, vous pouvez bien poser les questions en français comme vous voulez.
Just because I have the micro, so maybe okay. Then yes, I think that in this session we saw how xerography was a time-based medium, and so I would like to expand a little bit on this point.
Yeah, I guess there's two ways of considering time with Rita's work. Time in terms of her own life and her coming to Xerox and her deciding to actually let go of copying with like computer art and digital art and things like that. So there's actually time in terms of her practice, because actually her copying art is between 1983 and 1984, a little bit in 1985, but that's it. And obviously time in terms of recreating her family history. So I guess considering time I guess I have a bias, but through also how we consider time within photo history, and about reusing her own personal family archive, re-giving it another life again and again and again is also, I guess, one way of considering time in Rita's work. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I would say that one thing I didn't comment on before is that Patti talked many times about how quickly her finger would, she could make 50 images in a minute. And she spoke about how hard it was to evaluate anything she was doing at the moment she was making it. And there was this feeling that I think we all know now about this generation of imagery that we imagine we'll consider later. So there's this feeling of being in the moment, taking advantage of a situation that's performative in some way. I actually want to read something she said about the space that she made for herself with her copier. This is when she had her machine at home. She said, "Working in a confined space with very circumscribed objects gave me an immense feeling of freedom and childlike irresponsibility." So there's this sense of the machine just making stuff that she's attending and will deal with later. And this notion of an archive in formation, even in the 70s and so on. There's, as somebody going through the archive now, there's this feeling that these images were made to be considered and evaluated much in the time that we're doing this at this moment, because there was just too much to evaluate at the moment of creation. And that would be my short answer.
Yeah, I think in relation to Sonia's work, there's a lot of kind of say dimensions of time that is at stake. One anecdote I think would be appropriate to tell here is that she was always aware of time as this grand historical process. She was intimately aware of big historical revolutionary events, and she actually took part in one of such event when Stalin sent the chairman of the communist of the Communist Party in France to America to tell the Americans to shut down the Communist Party. She was the translator of that conversation. A very young woman at that time, but she was always she always felt like she was where history was happening. That's something that she kept returning to. But of course, another dimension is her fascination with modern science and its rediscovery or its discovery of time as a fourth dimension. That's something she would. I mean, I'm not an expert on time as the fourth dimension, but it's really something that she would constantly talk about, this idea that there was a fourth dimension and that dimension was time. And then the last version of dimension of time was, she was really fascinated with a book from 1962 called The Shape of Time, which looked at how objects change over time. This was more from an anthropological standpoint, but that book was a huge inspiration to her to see how things were never the same. An object would always change over time, and therefore it would also change every time it would be run through the machine. So it's like you can't run through you can't jump into the same river twice. You can't put an image on the same copier twice. I think that would be the way of translating that. So so there's both a personal notion of time and a historical version of time and a scientific version of time at play, and a technological version of time also.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, George Kubler, is the author, The Shape of Time. Very inspiring, interesting book. So there is a second question.
Karen, did you want to ask something on the same subject? Because I saw you. No. Okay. So, yes, I had a question for Richard about Pati Hill's photocopies, in particular of objects, and the book Impossible Dreams. And just looking at her work before today, I had I'd thought about Nadia, the Breton book of 1928, and, the thing that Breton said about the photographs. Well, he said many things, but one of the things he said was, "Oh, when will all books be illustrated by photographs like these, and which have the look of old printed books?" And I think it's not so much the actual photographs by Boiffard, which Pati Hill's photocopies remind me of, but it's perhaps more the way that they're reproduced in the Nadia book, that they look, they look a bit like photocopies just in the reproduction of the photographs. And I have the feeling that that's kind of what Breton was getting at, when he said, when will they all have this look? It's not so much the what you could say the gestural style of the photograph. It's more the way that the photograph looks when it's reproduced in a book alongside printed pages. So I had always wondered, and I want to ask you, whether you think her interest in combining photocopies with text is at all influenced or shaped by an interest in surrealist books or other like photo books, perhaps particularly in France, whether that's an interest that she had.
That's a great question. I did look into Nadia, and Orlando, for example, is another example. Henry James illustrated a book of his with photographs. And I think what distinguishes her book, and I don't have a physical copy of it here, it's really asking to be reprinted because there are no more copies now, but is the way that the ink that's being used for the text is also being used for the image. And there's this feeling of the images have a kind of textuality that is really palpable when you actually hold the book. There's this feeling that it's the same material that's been reconfigured to make an image and then to make a text. And it's so unified in the object itself. It's something that is so perfect. And we do have the collection of the actual photocopies that she sent to the printer. And it's very interesting to see those in relation to what happened, because there was a transformation, more degradation that happens in the offset process that unifies the text and the image in a way that is incredibly material. And I think they are in the same world of illustration. She was very much against the idea of the images illustrating the text. She thought that they really did work to create something different and often worked against the story. And when I first handled this book, I thought it was a bunch of texts that were joined with images that had nothing, that the idea that it's a novel. And it does tell a story that you can read in the space of an hour or two about a woman who basically ends up having a relationship with a neighbor, another woman in the same building, and the destruction of the family. So it could be turned into a film, and she thought of it as a film, as much as she thought of it as a narrative or literary work. So it's yeah.
Can I ask a very quick follow-up? Sorry, yeah. I don't want to take too much time, but so that I think there's two ways in which the question of surrealism had occurred to me in relation to Pati Hill, and one is, and I would be inclined to emphasize with the first one, which we just talked about the printed book and illustration of a printed book, which it does seem so important, as you say, that the ink is the same and that it's a unified. I think that's really first. But then also there are these photographs of individual objects. So now just thinking about the object, and of course the photograph of the glove in Nadia, and then also Pati Hill's photograph of gloves from the Alphabet of Common Objects. So you do think about the history in surrealist photography, now thinking about the actual image content of isolated objects which are inexplicable or mysterious or enigmatic, and if you think of Man Ray's photography as well. So I wonder whether you think that now at the level of the image, she's still shaped by surrealist photography as opposed to printed books.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a great question. I think it's funny that surrealism doesn't come up in any of the discussion of the writing. I don't think she was so interested in disjunction as much as she was interested in generation, and sort of the two things coming together to offer interpretive material for the reader. But that, I think I would love to continue this discussion because I think it needs to be had. Thank you.
Sorry, this is a quick follow-up, Richard, just on this subject. Oh, okay. So just following on, it struck me that there's something quite similar to this book by Jennifer Bartlett called Autobiography that she wrote it in the 70s, but it came out in the, I think maybe in the 80s, where there's a juxtaposition of text and image in a very similarly sort of disjunctive but connective way. Mm-hmm. And so I just was interested to know who was she talking to? Who were her peer group? I don't know very much about Pati Hill, I have to say. So it's really intriguing to think about who she was writing in relation to, if anyone.
That's a great question, and maybe something that I couldn't give time to before, but she was married to a gallerist, and Paul Bianchini in the early 60s was one of the first commercial gallerists to sell pop art. And she was in the gallery many, many times. There's a funny story, Dorothy Lichtenstein, who was fundamental in helping us rescue the material from her studio, said that the first time she saw Pati Hill was when she was asleep on the floor in the gallery. So she was there a lot. And I think that she, because of her relationship with Bianchini, developed a kind of cynicism about the art world. She called it an art club. She made jokes about art works. She basically tried to distance herself from the dialogue about contemporary art, though she was clearly listening. And in the end, enjoyed being, I think the isolation she savored. I mean, she was 53 when she first started to experiment with the machine. By that time, she and Paul had, taken other lovers, and she was very independent, and I think enjoyed not necessarily having a conversation. But the thing that's, to answer your question in terms of this discussion here today, she also was so excited when she was finally, her work was recognized by Marilyn McRae, who put her in this show called Electroworks. And there was an image of it yesterday, the cover of the three eggs. And suddenly after all, because she really did think that she was the only person working with the machine, and she actually says she was disappointed to discover later that she was not. But then when the shock of how could she, in the mid-70s not know about the Xerox Book or Fluxus or, so many other, prime examples. She was basically in her own bubble. And then suddenly she was in dialogue with IBM. She was given a copier not to copy eggs and swans. I didn't get to that, but or pear trees, as she did later with Versailles, but to sort of develop that symbol language that I showed you a page of, because Eames and convinced IBM that if she continued to develop that language, that the interface that they were looking for at the time, as they were shifting from photocopy, the copier industry to the computer industry, they were looking for those symbols that we all take for granted now. And that was the sort of reason that she got the copier. So she very much enjoyed then participating in that community for a while. And she talks about copy artists and mail artists. But by that time, she was working in such a way that involved putting pieces of the paper into the machine multiple times, that she could never mail anything away and give it away as she did initially. So she valued her work so much, and she felt that it had a kind of perfection that she had to stop being generous in that way. And I think she ended up burning a lot of bridges, to be honest. By the time she was in her 90s, it was clear that she was finally ready for curators to come and begin to engage with her work. Marie-Cécile is here. Maybe she could, I don't know if you could talk about, she knew Pati right at that phase of her life, but I think there was a sense that she enjoyed the community, but then she pulled away from it again because it didn't feel serious enough for her.
Thank you. And just one really quick question. Have you looked at material in IBM's archive, either Richard or Jacob, actually, because both artists seem to have had, like, artists in residence. I mean, do they have material?
To some
there?
extent, yeah. But there's only one extant machine in Stamford, Connecticut that works sometimes. Though we have two of the machines in our archive, and I'm hoping that we can get both of them working again at some point. But there's very little material, actually. And so it was funny that I didn't get to talk about her swan, but that was ended up being shown at Xerox instead of IBM. They bought a version of the swan which they cannot find now. So it's these at the time. I think there was a lot of goodwill, but not a lot of serious care that was given to the work. So, but that's a good question, and I would like to pursue that research if I could. Yeah.
There are more questions, but please allow me to jump in, and there's time enough for a question, but I would like to jump in to pose a question to all the three speakers. Namely, you started already answering it, Richard, namely to how these three artists, and I think you showed very clearly that there are interesting similarities between them, but also the interesting differences. How did they conceive themselves within the art scene? You started already, and I think Pati Hill seems to me the pioneer, because she started by an intentional misuse of IBM machines. So they were used in the business field, and then she decided to use it in another field. But at that time, it seems to me, copy art wasn't an established category. There was no label. So she worked somewhere in between different fields. So I see that might be her situation in the beginning, that maybe she didn't consider herself as an artist because there were no label for it. In Rita Keegan case, it seems to be different, because you showed this interesting quotation where she says, when I came to England for the first time, I felt like an American. And one of the reasons why she said so was because the art market, because in the US you can sell everything. So it seems that also she reflected about her position within as an artist, also within art history, because she uses collage, which is a tradition. And then, of course, the last example, Landy Sheridan, you mentioned her that she didn't want to treat it as a copy artist, because she insisted I produce new images, new pictures. So it seems that all the three, but in different ways, reflected about their status in the art context. Maybe you would like to comment a little bit on this. Maybe you start. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. I think what's fascinating about Rita's work is that, as a little girl, she had no doubt she wanted to become an artist, and she knew it existed. She knew it was a possibility. She went to art high school and then had an education as an artist, but felt as an outsider, as a citizen in the US at that time, and an outsider also within the art school in San Francisco, because she was also doing painting and fashion and all of those different things, and not focusing on one thing, not becoming like a sculpture or something like that. And then what is also interesting is that when she arrives in London in 1980, there's an emerging movement in England, and she arrives as an American and also with all this knowledge about the Harlem Renaissance and loads of other things, and she, in a way, imports or exports, I don't know, this kind of knowledge to young Black British artists too. So she has this. She's for sure knows she's an artist. She also knows she can be someone who can share knowledge about art. So, and she's also very interested in art history, and she's going to read all those books that I mentioned and things like that. But then realizes quite quickly that in Europe she'll never be considered as one, for the three different reasons I've mentioned in my paper: gender, race, and sexuality.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay, I can go. Do you want to say it?
Immediately to what Taous said, or because there is another question, and I think another one. So we have time. We have plenty of time, so you can jump in later.
No, I think for Sonia, it was. I mean, she strongly identified with being an artist, but she did not identify with being a commercial artist. Yeah. She's probably one of the most well-connected human beings I know. It's like when you talk with her, and you mentioned people from the art history of 1960s, 1970s, she had met them all. Like she had lived next to Jack Burnham, she had worked with Les Levine, of course she worked with Stan Vanderbeek. I mean, she knew everyone.
And even Warhol, you mentioned Warhol.
Yeah, well, he
right?
came to the show but she never had a kind of a professional, personal relation to him. But other than that, it seemed like she knew everyone. But it was never for her an economy of advancing in the system of art. Like to go into the commercial world was never an issue for her. She never wanted to. She thought, if I go into the commercial world, people will start working with me for different reasons, and they won't just call me up and say, can we do an experiment? So, although, I mean, when you present her work to people today, I mean, I know so many people that want to own one of her pieces, but she never wanted to sell. She would rather give them away than sell them.
Okay.
And I think that's also part of her legacy, that why she wasn't, I mean, she was right there when all these things were happening, but she didn't want to take part in that part of the art world that was emerging in the 1960s, 1970s. In a way, she was artist in a kind of 1920s sense, like early 20th century sense of the artist working to better society. I mean, her parents' background in kind of a socialist view of art was still with her very much. She would work, she saw art as one discipline together with science that would work for the betterment of society and human life. So yeah, commercial was not how she would identify as an artist, for sure.
Thank you.
I think it's so important, especially with this conference, we're all talking about artists that were working with Xerox, so in a way, always outsiders to the more traditional conservative history of art. Yet, I think it is very important also to consider when it was a choice and an attitude towards commercial networks, and not something imposed. And so I think there's the choice of being an outsider as an artist attitude. Yeah, I think it's the behavior, attitude, or even as part of the artist's discourse about themselves and about how they want to present to the world. And there's another thing about being imposed to be an outsider. And I think that's also very important.
Okay, thank you. Richard, yeah, okay, so then there is...
Yeah, maybe rather than a question, just a quick comment on something that Richard already said. I think what is important to consider is that Patti was in very close contact with Diane Arbus. They were incredible close friends. They were partners in conversation, that they would exchange what you can call works that you find also in the Hill collection at Acadia University up until her death in the early 70s, her suicide. And in fact, one of the last projects, endeavors of Patti was to rewrite or write a biography, an extended biography of the work of Diane, which has never been published, but I'm really excited about that being sort of future, hopefully, exist in print. And I think to sort of map out this territory, especially like the sinister humor that you see in some of her novels, was that she was also in close conversation with someone like Truman Capote, for example. They went on holidays, seems to be quite regularly, which is sort of funny to consider. And then working towards her first shows in Europe in 2020, sort of on a different strand of research, I was finding letters in the archive of the concrete poetry artist called Rudolf Rehfelder. The archive is in Berlin, and there were also some letters that they interestingly exchanged, or at least like the letters to Jill that Rudolf was sent from Patti. So yeah, just to map out that territory.
Okay, thanks a lot. There is a question in the background, and then you.
Me or?
Go ahead.
So the pop artist Ed Ruscha said that what separated him from Warhol and Lichtenstein is that when he reproduced an object, he could only reproduce it at actual size. And he talked about it as treating the object right, or having a certain reverence for the object. So it seemed to me that that is something that maybe unites both Hill and Keegan in their work, and I wonder if I was so struck by the words intensity or immediacy in a process that most of us regard as utter drudgery, and whether that reverence for the object is part of that ability to transform something that is drudgerous into something that has intensity or immediacy.
Thank you for that question, Andrew. It's exactly right, isn't it? To her, compared to her process with painting or sewing or making clothes or any kind of other artistic endeavor she conducted, this was, in a way, for her quicker and less complicated and less messy, and she was able to go to places to do it and could make a few montages or within a few hours. And so that was for her kind of amazing compared to painting, where she had to find the canvas and the painting and the money for it and the studio. She was almost homeless at that time. So so I think this is so important. And also compared to other practitioners that we've been talking about, there's something very, yes, there's a dedication to the practice and to working it again and again in order to make this layers of colors, this dedication to the images she uses, and also this obsession with specific photographs that she uses again and again and again, discarding other photographs that she had in her albums, creating like very special relationships to those photographs, even bonds that were so important to her, and being able to take care of those photographs through the making of the copies. And I think the word care is quite important in our ways of considering Keegan's work. So yeah, care or reverence, both. Exactly right, yes. So thank you.
Is there anyone else who wants to comment on the life-size question?
No.
She said that one of it's very challenging for the camera in photography to reproduce the scale of something exactly, but the copier does it, automatically. And I think that was one way that she sort of realized that she talked about the human size scale of the pictures, that relationship that we have with the real scale of the world was something she wanted in her own work. And that was really important to her, like a kind of rule that she eventually broke. But it took her 30 years before she could play with scale that way. There was a reverence to the one-to-one relationship that wasn't about an illusion, but more about a kind of veracity, a kind of, honoring the scale of the original thing.
Okay. There are three more questions. One, I think you were the first, right, in the background, and then you, and then you. Thank you.
My question is returning to the issue of temporality, but it seems to me there's a couple of divisions, or binaries. One between instantaneity. Pati Hill, you said, mentioned instantaneity, and I think that was also the sense of Marshall McLuhan's idea that this would be instant publishing, the idea yesterday was also mentioned that unlike photography, there's no lab development. So instantaneity versus duration of various kinds, because obviously, with these like recopying a copy or shifting the thing as it's on the copier, there is duration in the process. And then also a kind of like vitalist temporality of growth and generations like the generations of the family, or yesterday with the still lives, kind of Memento Mori and Chadwick, versus the temporality of machines, a kind of like tuck, 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 and also that this is getting faster and faster. That's the whole selling point of Xerox. So a kind of like accelerating temporality of technology. So I think what I want to get to is like, is there some temporal nature to this medium, Or is it just a set of machine protocols and rules through which temporality can be explored in different dimensions?
Okay, thank you. Who wants to start?
Yeah. I think the quick answer, and I think it's a great question, is yes. Machines are processual, and so those, and to some extent those processes can be manipulated. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the instantaneity that's in focus. For Sonia's work, there was many ways of stretching time. It was a concept she used a lot as titles in her work, like slowing down the machine's imaging process, which I think was part of this idea of visualizing the invisibility of time. And you mentioned duration. She was an avid reader of Henri Bergson, and so she was, of course, well aware of the philosophical dimensions of what time was. But there was also maybe another time that would be interesting, is how an image can travel from technology to technology over time. So in her later years, around the time when I did the show in Berlin, she would pick up images from the 60s and 70s and reprocess them in the computer in Photoshop or whatever software she had. Of course, that's a very kind of direct reference to the Shape of Time Kubler book. But that's another time that the evolution of technology is also a temporal process, and images travel through that process and change or transform in various ways.
So that there's like the nostalgia about this technology that was passing, like a nostalgia in advance, you said, that Pati Hill had about the technology that was already going to go away or something like that.
One thing I want to say is that I didn't get to show examples of a series of works she did in the early 80s involving scarves. And a lot of these scarves she would drag across the machine, and sort of looking like some of Sonia's work, where it's, you know, the Kodak machine, there was a machine that was produced by Kodak in the 80s, I think, that used a flash. And so the image was made within a second. But what's so interesting about the scanner is that it actually does take time to go from one side of the platen to the other. And so that even in that sort of tiny little window of time, a lot of stuff can happen. And what's his name? Boetti, the Italian artist, actually did beautiful pieces where little chicks were recorded as they walked across the platen. So there is this sort of, it's the instantaneity is maybe not exactly accurate, because it is a duration that artists did learn to exploit and explore.
Good point.
Thank you for that question. I think I've made too many notes, but I think I would like to answer that with another question and ask, if there's a time specificity, is there a gendered time specificity? We talked about artists that turn to copying art because of being mothers and not having time to do anything else. Or we talked about, in the case of Rita Keegan, actually having the time, but having fun with it for different kind of like class reasons. And I feel like time should be considered with gender. And also going back to Marisol's points yesterday about boys' relationship to the technique and to the machine and to the ways, like they were so interested in the ways the machine worked, and maybe also going back to Chadwick's considerations and how we also now with our 2021 eyes struggle with this kind of iconography of the, like, what is the feminine, what is the masculine. And I don't know, the whole conference for the past 2 days, I've been wondering, like, what is the gendered specificity of women copying artists making those kind of copies, and is there a specificity? And I think in time, considering it in a very practical way, I think we might find the beginning of an answer. Yeah, so I don't know. It's me rambling, but I think there's something that we need to explore about gender, time, and copying art.
Okay, there are two more questions, or three. A bit short, if possible, short questions and short answers. Yeah, that was the...
Thank you. I am Marisa Gonzalez. For the ones you were not yesterday in my presentation, I talk a lot about my work, but mainly about Sonia Sheridan, the close relationship I had with her as a sister, as a son, daughter, as friend, as you know. And Pati Hill also, I met her many times. Of course, I wasn't as close as with Sonia Sheridan, and they both had the position in their life of expanding and communicating with the rest of people the knowledge and the ideas, of course, the techniques, but not only the techniques, but the attitude towards the machine. Sonia, with her classes and with the lately with her Facebook close group, so we all are connected and very active. And before, as you said, with many friends all over the world. And Pati Hill, she had a gallery, a toner in Paris, and it was, she asked artists to participate. I participated several times. And then she moved to Sens, here also in France, with Paul Bianchini, her husband, and they also ran a space, and they invited us also. So they didn't want to keep for themselves. They want to expand their possibilities. So as human beings, for me, it's very important to point that. And Sonia was the daughter of the president of the Communist Party in the United States. You can understand the Communist Party in the United States, it was something like amazing. But so she was politically, was very compromised and very democratic. And Pati Hill, in her third marriage with Paul Bianchini, she found help, or how do you say, a company that helped her to do all of those projects. And Sonia's husband, he was a magnificent and unbelievable man, also a specialist in Chinese, and he was a very good help to her as company, as love. She sent me the love letters. They interchanged each other, and it was, I mean, my skin are already, so it was amazing how much love and how much respect for their own professions. So when she came to Spain, she brought her husband also, so we were all together, and so they live together to potentially well, my English now is okay, it's finished. They were great, the two of them. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. There's one more short question, please, if possible.
It may not even be a question, perhaps just a reflection. It just strikes me that in the way that the artists present their work in some of their texts, there seems to be this discourse of scientific exactitude. I'm thinking also of those wonderful photographs of Sonia Sheridan in her lab coat, and this sort of scientific realm. And all the while, it seems to me that there's another current, which is the fetish and magic. And you know, when Pati Hill writes about actual intensity, that's completely, it seems to me, the opposite of what we're witnessing. We're witnessing, I mean, Andrew talked a minute ago about the reverence for the object. There's an intensification, surely, of intensity, and that the glitch that generates a magical transformation. And I just wonder whether any of the artists actually, engage with that kind of the fetish, which is itself, and it's something else. It's a kind of that magic, the spark turns the ordinary, the hair roller into a spaceship. I just wondered whether their writing does engage with that magic and that transformation.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, and I think the wearing of lab coats in Sonia's case was actually by coincidence. The lab coats were just there in the room that they were given at the School of the Arts School of Chicago. And she said, "Well, we'll take them. Then people will believe we're doing something important here." But that said, I think for her using that machine was never just kind of like an action painting in technological terms. It was not about just pressing, going wild. As I also talked with Marissa about yesterday, she would spend quite a lot of time just thinking about what to do, preparing for the magic to happen. And then she would just let the machine do the thing. So it's more conceptually, technically getting the machine ready to produce its own magic. That's how I would look at it. So, but I don't think I would ever see it in fetishistic terms in that way, but definitely in terms of a wonder.
Mm-hmm. Patti actually used the word magicalizing. She said, "I did not know how to think about this development and took refuge in magicalizing the copier and its babies. I had once revered, as I had once revered the cameras I posed for." So I think she thought of the copier as the artist, and she was just collaborating. She was standing next to the copier, helping as an assistant in a way like secretaries would for their bosses. And again, I would love to have more time to talk about how there's a moment she describes when she's photocopying a tree, and she has to decide so much about how it's a espaliered pear tree from Versailles, so it's already flattened, and she brought it on a bus from Versailles to her studio, and she begins to copy it. She's initially thinking that she's going to cut the tree up in sections to do that, but it blooms surprisingly in her studio, and she knows that it's a living thing. She can't destroy this thing. So she tries to photocopy it, piece by piece. And the choices suddenly are so different than the kinds of choices she had before when she was copying a button or an egg or whatever. So she describes how she had to really take the control of that moment and sort of dominate the machine in a way that the machine had previously dominated her own vision and practice. And it sort of is a turning point for her. And the art that she makes sort of after that is very different. And to some extent, the first period of her work is, I think, an art without art, or it's more like research or science. And that's sort of what, when I think of Sonia's work, there's a feeling of the images are not artworks, they're documents. They're records of questions, and the copier is providing the answers. And it's up to us to make of it what we will. And in that, I don't know if that helps.
Okay, so thanks a lot. I think we could go on and on posing questions. Thanks to the three fascinating talks we had. I think some of the questions will come up during, for example, the question that Taous Dahmani posed, is there a gender specificity in our topic? I think this is something that we should discuss later on. So thanks a lot, and going to the speakers.